Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are going to be talking today all about influence operations and attributions. How do we figure out who's behind them and what are the best practices? I'm Mariana Spring. I'm the BBC's specialist disinformation reporter. So I spend a lot of time investigating the impact of and ecosystems in which disinformation and online conspiracy theories thrive. And one question I am asked all the time is this an influence operation? Who's behind it? Is it the Russians? Is it Iran? Is it China? Is it domestic? And so I, for one, definitely am very excited to speak to the panel we have with us today, who hopefully will be able to shed some more light on the best practices, particularly for journalists, researchers, and professionals when it comes to investigating foreign influence campaigns or domestic influence campaigns and how we attribute them. So I'm joined by Emerson Brooking, who is a resident senior fellow at the Digital Forensic Lab of the Atlantic Council, DFR, and the co-author of Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media. I'm also joined by Olga Belakalova, I hope I've said that right, maybe not quite right, who is a policy manager for influence operations at Facebook, where she coordinates the company's IO disruption efforts and development of policies to respond to both covert and overt influence operations. And we're also joined by Elise, who I think might be having a little bit of trouble with her Wi-Fi, who's an open source analyst with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And she also has written for the Daily Beast, The Guardian, and other publications. And just on cue, I think she's back. One of the things we're going to be talking about today, are you with us all right, Elise?
Great. I'm trying to be. Can you hear me?
Good. Okay. Well, why don't we get started and talk a little bit about what this means and what you guys do. And so I'll begin by starting with you, Emerson. Let's start with the broader question. When it comes to influence operations, foreign or domestic, is attribution different to making claims or allegations about who's behind a particular operation or network?
Well, thanks for the question, Mariana, and thanks to the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations for hosting us here today. I would say that an attribution is a line in the sand. When you're in our field, you can allege that a particular network is engaging in inauthentic activity. You can insinuate that particular activity bears maybe the characteristics of known state actors, or that it seems to be promoting content that favors particular actors. But an attribution to a particular actor, a declaration that this activity is being conducted by that actor, that's kind of the nuclear option. And a few months ago, I and my team at the DFR lab led a project examining attribution claims over the course of the 2020 election. We wanted to categorize and create an inventory of them. That work's available at interference2020.org. But the main purpose of the project was actually to look at the relative attention that different claims got, and to also evaluate the credibility of particular claims, and to try to figure out, was there some connection between the strength of evidence of a claim and how much public attention it received? And our answer was, in short, no. And our answer was also that when a claim of attribution was made in the course of any sort of analysis of inauthentic activity, it was that attribution that carried the day. Most readers, or even an informed audience, they might care a little that people are being misled, but they care a lot when there's a particular name attached to that, whether that was formerly the Russian Internet Research Agency or particular actors in Iran. And when that attribution was made, it basically canceled out or superseded anything else as far as the public interest was concerned. And in particular, we found, for instance, just over the course of 2020, that a number of very vague attributions would be made to China with regard to information operations targeting the US. And more specific claims were made regarding Russia. But the attention paid to these Chinese attributions was often equal to or greater than the attention paid to these particular Russian attributions. So what I'm getting at is that actors seem to understand, the individuals who make these attribution claims seem to understand the attention that they're going to garner. In the case of these US government claims, it was recently revealed in the ODNI report on foreign interference in 2020 that it seems that the Trump administration actually overstated the extent of Chinese interference. In part, it seems to have canceled out or shifted away from attention paid to Russian interference. So the question of attribution is not only one of research standards, but it's also extremely politically salient. We increasingly see different actors sort of using that to shift direction or shift attention in one direction or another. And I'll close by observing beyond government entities, because attributions receive so much attention, there's also an incentive for nonprofits and civil society organizations like our own to make them. And particularly in a field that's received so much attention recently, but has a finite number of resources and funders available, there's often an incentive, especially for newer organizations, to make attribution claims, often without sufficient evidence. So it's very important to be having this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Emerson. That was a great opening answer. And to move on to you, Olga, and follow up on that, which Emerson has hinted at, what are the risks of making attributions, and what's the worst that can happen if you get it wrong, if you make an incorrect attribution?
Yes, thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me. I think, attribution claims, as Emerson said, are taken quite seriously by the general public, and that's why it's important to be really responsible about what it is that we say and what it is that we don't say. So, attribution claims without evidence can not only harm our discourse and the information environment, but can also serve the interests of certain threat actors who either aim to breed further distrust of institutions or engage in what we call perception hacking in an effort to appear more effective or popular than they actually are. As someone who actually worked for several years as a threat investigator myself, focused on Russian influence operations, I can't count the number of times that I heard someone cry wolf around Russia, only to investigate the claim later and find that the lead was not only domestic in origin, but also run by authentic individuals. So it's important to be serious about what we can and cannot prove. Spurious evidence-free claims can create a certain specter around this problem and around certain threat actors that not only serves to further undermine civic debate, but also, undermines what we are all trying to protect. We also need to be careful about how we make these claims, sticking to the available evidence of command and control of an operation. And as a broad community of researchers, we don't always have the evidence. We won't always see who is sponsoring a particular operation, for example. And increasingly, we see threat actors more effectively obfuscating their relationship to their sponsoring organization by improving operational security, co-opting individuals, or in some cases, outsourcing to firms that are engaging in influence for hire.
Thank you so much, Olga. I think particularly the point you made about Russia, one thing that we've certainly seen a lot of here in the UK, but definitely in the US and across the world, are cries of Russian bots all the time now, when actually it can be a lot more complicated. Here in the UK, it often ends up being actually nothing to do with a foreign influence operation, but some people sitting at home copy and pasting the same message. So definitely agree with you on that point. That's not to undermine how serious and important this topic is. Just to come to you now, Elise, how do you think that attribution should be communicated when you're trying to explain them to the broader public or in reports? And why and when should we publicly attribute? Should we say, right, we know who's done this, this is who we think it is?
I guess there's so many precursors to that step where who is the we there? Because obviously there is a significant difference between a government agency making an attribution to a journalist, to a researcher, to sort of the host of other actors that are starting to play in this space. As Emerson said, it is a broadening field, and we are sort of now seeing, in addition to academics, journalists, think tank researchers, we're also starting now to see private corporations come in, either because they have a product to sell or because there's some other commercial motive there. So the we in that circumstance is getting much broader, and because those actors are all operating with different motivations and under different constraints, the situations in which they attribute and why are quite diverse. So yeah, I guess it depends in what context, which isn't a very helpful answer.
It's a good answer.
Yeah. I mean, I guess more broadly, like speaking as a journalist and a researcher, in general, I would say attribute when you have a confidence that you are correct, when you're confident in your level of attribution. But again, that's a whole separate level of separate can of worms in terms of like what counts as a solid level of attribution. So.
And when it comes to, particularly as a journalist, communicating to your audience what this means and what it doesn't mean, do you find that difficult? You know, what do you tend to do? I know it's something that I get a lot of questions about, and people tend to want a very simple answer when the answer sometimes isn't that simple.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that, like, I've seen it from both sides as a journalist and also as a researcher explaining my work to journalists. And I have found it interesting, the difference between those two roles. Because I find as a researcher in particular, like, I am very conscious about being backward leaning in attribution, like really trying to really highlight the level of uncertainty. If there is uncertainty around the attribution, really trying to highlight we're not sure, it could be this, but maybe it's not. Because I find that journalists tend to lean in the other direction for the reasons that Emerson highlighted, that you get a lot more attention for a story. It's much easier if you're a journalist trying to persuade your editor that a story is worth following, if you can give them an attribution, and particularly if it's a flashy attribution, if you can say it was Russia, it was China. And so, you know, my experience as a researcher, and you know, like, there are some journalists who are great about this, but there are also some journalists who will really push you to try and get you to say it was Russia, it was China, to give them that attribution. So I found it interesting sort of negotiating between those two perspectives and those two different, I guess, roles, that both of which are like valid and important in this kind of broader context.
Thanks so much. Follow on from that, and to ask you a similar question, Emerson. In your opinion, why and when should we attribute? What would be your response to the why when question?
So first, I find it interesting. We've risen to different heights, but all of us have a journalistic background. I was a small town newspaper reporter for a bit. And I think that's a characteristic of a lot of folks in this field regarding background. And I would say you make an attribution, you apply a basic journalistic standard. You need corroboration from two credible independent sources. That's the approach that we've taken at the DFR lab. And that's often led to, some internal consternation, because we can have a sure thing. We can have what is almost certainly inauthentic activity based on our external assessment. We've had, whistleblowers or leakers come to us who allege something as well, but we try to draw the line at a second source as well, just to keep us from being manipulated or misled. So that's often meant that we have surety that there's something going on, but we're not at a point where we can make an affirmative attribution. So sometimes we've handed off that mostly completed report to another partner who can help push us over the finish line. But I would say, for all the reasons we're outlining, one should show great caution before taking that final step. And indeed, in our more recent work, we've tried to state when there's insufficient evidence to make an attribution. Because as Elise pointed out, quite often, journalists with the best of intentions, they're talking to us about research we've done, and we're saying maybe something bears characteristics of previous Iranian state operations because it's promoting the same themes and might have some of the same behavioral patterns. If you're writing up a 500-word story on this, kind of makes sense to say, okay, is it Iran? but we can't take that step. And we increasingly try to make it clear we cannot take that step, just to try to temper the broader coverage of these particular analyses.
Much for that, Emerson. You all work, as you actually highlighted very nicely there. Everyone has different backgrounds here and different specialisms, but a lot have a journalistic background. Elise, should journalists, academics, governments be given different allowances when it comes to attribution standards? You know, who should be able to say what, and does it differ? Oh, I think you're on mute, Elise. Sorry. Oh, good.
Sorry, I think we all got muted when we were trying to resolve Olga's dishco that was going on there. I thought this was a really interesting question, because I suppose my first question in response to it was like, who was giving the allowance? That like there is no independent body here, and so like the question of whether we should give a different allowance to journalists or researchers of governments seems kind of moot to me, in that like there is no independent regulator. There probably won't be an independent regulator. Like I can't see that happening at any point in the near future. But it is interesting, I think, and interesting and useful to think about, like I was sort of saying earlier, the fact that all of these different actors who are now operating in this space of influence operations and attributing influence operations are operating with different motivations, with different capabilities and different constraints. And that probably the responsible thing to do as someone looking at these attributions is to think about the role that each of these actors plays. So, for example, if you think about an attribution from a journalistic perspective, you think about the motivations there. Like there is, as Emerson said, there's a motivation to have the most attention-grabbing attribution. There's a motivation to be first. So there's time pressures there. There's probably limited capabilities, and that newsrooms are often quite small, and most of the journalists who are working on this stuff are pressed really hard. And that's sort of the, and I guess the constraints on journalists are quite different from the constraints on, say, government actors, who are sort of coming at it from almost the opposite perspective, where they are not necessarily looking for a flashy attribution, although there may be. Like their motives for making an attribution are probably very different from a journalist. They have significantly more capabilities, and the constraints on them are also like notably different, probably like both from a legal and a diplomatic perspective. So yeah, like I said, so I don't think it's a matter of giving them different allowances, because I don't think there's anybody to do that. But they are all operating within kind of their own little prisms, and that's a useful thing to think about, I think.
Thank you, Elise. Olga is disco party. I have one question for you, Olga, which follows on from what both Elise and Emerson were saying. Who do you think can reasonably make an attribution, and how? We've just been talking about governments, journalists, social media sites, and so on.
It depends on, the available evidence. There is open source evidence, privileged information of some kind. Governments, tech platforms, threat intelligence organizations, and civil society researchers each have sort of their own visibility into an operation, and each can make their own respective assessments with the respective confidence that they might have about each attribution. What we've actually seen is how well this can apply when we have a whole of society approach. There's a really good example with the now infamous troll farm in Ghana, linked to the Internet Research Agency, where at first investigators at Facebook and Twitter identified accounts based on threat tracking that they were doing ahead of the US 2020 election. When researchers were working at Clemson University, at Graphica, together with Clarissa Ward and her team at CNN, where they were conducting their own investigations simultaneously, including interviews with some of the individuals involved. So the work done in this case to investigate some of these accounts by expert investigators at platforms was reinforced by the on-the-ground reporting that was being done, the intrepid on-the-ground reporting that was being done, and vice versa. So there was a corroboration happening between, this whole of society approach between researchers from different organizations and journalists.
Thanks so much, Olga. Back to what we were saying about governments, the difference between what governments, social media companies, and journalists can do in terms of attribution, or whether there should be any difference. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, Emerson. Do you agree with what Elise was saying? Is there anything that you'd add?
Sure. I think we should understand that there are different methods available between government, technology companies, and civil society. From a civil society perspective, ideally, independent researchers aren't tapping phone lines, and they probably don't have insight into like IP addresses and internal platform activity. So when we're making that affirmative attribution, we have to rely on human sources, or we end up partnering with someone who has access to those human sources, who has access to that privileged technical data, and we combine that with the assessments that and the information that we've been able to gather independently. And I think it's been that start, that sort of sometimes informal collaboration, which has led to some of the most important attributions in this space that haven't come entirely from a state entity.
Thank you so much. Elise, to come back to you, when you're investigating an influence operation or reporting on it, how do you guard against bad attributions? What are your safeguards to make sure that you don't mess it up? Also, I think you're still on mute. Sorry.
Am I muted now?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Well, I didn't have a particularly. I think paranoia is my answer. So just like checking and double checking every sort of piece of evidence that we have. That being said, like I guess the question of how you guard against bad attributions is not like a cookie cutter approach, because obviously you're looking across a range of different kinds of influence operations, and so with every case, like how you're doing attribution will be different. And that also depends, like the perspectives and the capabilities that you're coming at it with. So for example, if I'm coming at it with like a researcher hat on, where I'm sort of working with a think tank with a team of colleagues, that's obviously quite different from if I'm doing it as a freelancer and I'm just coming in by myself with quite limited resources. So honestly, like I don't think there's any particular set answer.
Okay.
Yeah, academic, law enforcement, and platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been careful about using a model that of confidence levels, estimative language around assessing an attribution. How confident do we feel about what we see? Is it low, medium, or high confidence? On our end, normally we don't attribute to a particular actor, individual, or organization unless we're confident about our assessment. And we are quite careful about our public attribution language for this very reason, which is one of the reasons you see us use language like this network as links to individuals with links to a particular organization versus a network that is linked to this organization. Right? Because we don't want to be speculating about, what we don't know. And we have a responsibility that we carry about how our attribution assessments can benefit research, resilience, and future discovery.
And Emerson, did you have some thoughts on that as well?
Mm-hmm. And to that, I would just add, again, this word corroboration, which is critical for our field. And also, I think it's helpful to practice horizontal thinking, which is something we wrote about back in, we were writing Like War in 2017, but just the idea, and a lot of us do this instinctively if we're on the internet, but instead of reaching so deep into a particular investigation to always be able to step back and consult alternative sources or leads, just to see if you're heading in the right direction, to see if your ideas are being echoed elsewhere. Because something that I think a lot of us struggle with in this study of influence operations is that you can kind of fall down a rabbit hole yourself. You can get so drawn into a particular theory of a particular actor doing particular things that you already know your destination, and then you're just going deep into a network and maybe seeing sock puppets where none exist because you're sure of that destination and you want to reach it. And so, there's a very fine line between, I think, some of the best work that's been done in this space and extremely conspiratorial thinking, which can be deeply counterproductive and can often be disinformation itself. And here I think it's worth noting just how much this field has evolved since 2016 or 2017, when a lot of us did see Russians behind every suspicious social network, because at that point our only publicly available information in the United States and in Britain regarding these Russian influence networks was just a handful of suggestions, of claims, and of a US government report that had said that there was Russian activity, but left many details and many questions unanswered. So as I look back, my approach in 2017 was if someone was making a particular claim, I gave it a lot more weight than I should have. And I think as time has gone on, we've had the opportunity to evolve as a community, to mature, and to think a lot more cautiously before we make these sorts of claims. As more information too has become available as to the actual extent, breadth, and impact of these influence operations.
Leads perfectly on to my next question, which is to Olga. How much have you seen influence operations evolve and change in the past 5 years, particularly, and not just who's behind them, but the way that we look into them, and also the different tactics and the sophistication of those tactics? Oh, Olga, I'm so sorry. I think you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think we're all trying to mute ourselves so that our respective sound doesn't influence anyone else's speaking capabilities. Well, yeah, thank you so much for the question. We've certainly seen a lot of interesting trends in the evolution of influence operations. And in part, this is because of sort of the defender community, some of which is gathered here today. We're seeing in some cases a reaction to all of the actions that we've taken. For example, we've noticed that threat actors have increasingly obfuscated their activity. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we have seen is, an increase of influence for hire operations. So, one of the ways in which threat actors can try to sort of distance themselves from their activity is perhaps, through better operational security, but also perhaps through hiring someone else to do their work for them. Whether that's, co-opting individuals on the ground to engage in a certain type of activity, or to actually hire an organization to do this. And so, a lot of the networks that we've taken down over the course of the last couple of years have actually been domestic in nature. And also, have been influenced for higher types of organizations. We've linked a number of networks to PR firms and sort of marketing operations and outfits. And that's definitely one of the trends that we've seen. Another interesting trend that we've come across that I think really plays into this conversation and discussion is the trend of perception hacking. So this is this idea of trying to appear more popular than you actually are, or more effective than you actually are. And this is something that we've seen in particular with Russian threat actors, where we've seen operations that are relatively small in size or are caught earlier in their stage of their operations, but really are trying to showcase, they may actually want to be caught, and they may actually want to be named and shamed. And that's one of the other things that I think we need to really guard against as we do attribution work, is think about how we might be playing into the hands of certain threat actors by making certain attribution claims. Are we actually continuing or helping to harm civic debate by, empowering some of these threat actors and also harming the information environment.
Thanks so much, Olga. I'm going to come back to you, Emerson. When it comes to attribution, do you think that the community should adopt a common attribution standard? Do you think that would be helpful? Do you think that we need more rules about it or not?
Let's see, as we've established here, the different actors making these attributions come from different places and have different capabilities available. So I think I would stop short of thinking that we can have a single standard that we can apply to everyone. But it was the case, when my team was comparing about 80 or 85 distinct attributions over the course of the 2020 US election, we did need to come up with some criteria by which to compare them. And we wound up coming up with a system which, in short, it evaluated each attribution claim based on the credibility of the entity that was making it. Had they engaged in disinformation in the past? Did they have particular political or financial motivations? And then also the political objectivity of that actor. And then also we took a look at their methods. How much evidence was provided? Could other individuals access part or all of the research or the data upon which that organization made its claims? And then to the transparency of their methods. Was it all privileged information that they were relying upon, or was there also an open source component? So I think we can have a general yardstick and general expectations by which to measure these different attributions.
Thank you so much for that. When it comes to particularly, one thing I find a lot is that people get in touch with me and they say, oh, I think that this could be an influence operation. Can you look into it? What's going on? To come to you, Elise, how often do you find that you look into something and it turns out to be a bit less sinister than you thought it might have been? And how often is that the opposite?
Oh, no, all the time. Part of doing this kind of work is you have to be prepared to run down rabbit holes and find out that they are just rabbit holes. There's a rabbit down the bottom. It's a real person. And the similarities between, one of the things that this job has really helped to bring home to me is that people are really weird. And by that I mean there are a lot of different subcultures, like internet subcultures, just like different cultural norms on the internet. You might look at something and think, oh, that is such a weird thing to do. Clearly that is some sort of influence operation. And you look into it and you find out that it's the equivalent of your grandma. And you're like, oh yeah, my grandma probably would do this if she had a Twitter account, which she doesn't, thank goodness. And so that happens all the time. But I did want to chime in back on the question a minute ago about sort of whether or not there should be standards applied for attributions. And one of the things that I, always try to be conscious of is this conversation, particularly around sort of the professionalization of investigating influence operations, is still so US centric and so focused particularly on the developed world and particularly on the English speaking developed world and to some extent the European Union as well, because that's where the money is, that's where the funding is. And I think we are still quite in the early stages of understanding how the funding for this kind of research has distorted the overall picture of the field. So when we talk about, should we have attribution standards, what we are really saying is sort of people in the developed first world who are engaging primarily on influence ops, affecting the US, the EU, the UK, Australia. It's such a different picture across so much of the rest of the world. And I think, I think we do need to take the blinkers off a little bit and sort of think about what is a realistic thing which is possible for people with far fewer resources than all of us have access to. Particularly when you think about sort of the role that and the very real damage that has been done by being done by influence operations in places like Myanmar, in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, the enormous bot armies that Turkey unleashes all the time, which gets so little coverage. There is so much going on, and it's enormous, and it gets so little coverage. So yeah, I think that's a part of the conversation that's always worth bringing in, and I think trying to apply some sort of a global standard just doesn't seem like it's going to be a challenge.
That's a really important point that you make about particularly how influence operations affect parts of the non-English speaking world, and how we don't pay attention to them in quite the same way. To turn back to you, Olga, going forwards, what do you think that everyone can do to improve, whether that's the social media companies, whether that's journalists, whether that's researchers, whether that's governments, to better tackle the issue of influence campaigns and attributing them?
Yes, thank you so much. So, one of the things, to sort of bolster a lot of what Elise and Emerson have been saying around, standards, I think, one of the things that we can do is perhaps agree on a few things, right? We may not be able to have some kind of shared attribution shared across a number of different organizations, countries, industries, but, we can maybe agree on questions that we ask ourselves. What is our degree of confidence about something? Showing our work. Maybe testing our own assumptions, thinking about alternative hypotheses when we are doing attribution work, and perhaps thinking a little bit harder around how will my attribution here actually impact the research community and civic debate. And if we ask ourselves those types of questions, then perhaps we can at least, perhaps not have a set standard, but have a set expectation of how we are sort of responsible stewards of this space.
Thank you so much, Olga. Just to come to you, Emerson. One thing I often find when I'm reporting on influence operations or trying to get to the bottom of them, and on disinformation in general, is how to make it accessible for an audience who maybe don't use social media that much or don't necessarily understand the implications. Do you think that there's more that we could do to help to increase public understanding of influence operations and what they mean and why they happen?
Certainly. I think some more recent organizations in this space, primary intention, and I think PCIO, a primary intention is to do just that, to try to create more accessible frameworks to explain this issue and explain its seriousness to different publics. And I've found, breaking it down in simple terms, the fact that you might be reading something online with which you agree, but you may not understand that there are people out there who are trying to fool you, who are trying to consciously make you think that something's more popular than it actually is. To shift as much attention as possible to the individuals and to the fact that they're being misled or having the wool pulled over their eyes. Because most people anywhere, they don't really care if platforms' terms of service are being misused or if there are bots out there. They care about why it matters for them. And I think we can do a better job of communicating that. But something else I've been thinking increasingly about, but don't have an easy answer for, and something that I think we've hinted at here, is that norms regarding this sort of behavior vary drastically depending on where you are. If you're in the US or European Union, in the developed world, there are different expectations than if you're in even democratic countries elsewhere, regarding just how normalized and appropriate this sort of behavior is. It was the case in, I think, state elections in the Philippines in 2020, or 2019, that both contesting political parties were freely using these sorts of techniques. If you look at historically the different sorts of voting mobilization that have happened in India, the world's largest democracy, And then the way that these sorts of social media manipulation have been applied in that context, it's not so far outside of particular norms. So I think we're beginning to see, and we'll see more pushback from some people in some nations who are saying that even our frame of influence operations is very much, pro-US, pro-Western, pro-Western intellectual property sort of frame, which doesn't necessarily describe political action everywhere in the world. I still think it's a problem. I think it's a problem because creating a false sense of popularity where none exists makes effective understanding of democratic equities impossible. But I think this other argument is going to increasingly present itself.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and reinforce that, because there are a number of countries in Asia, like Emerson said, India, but also Indonesia. We're seeing a lot of this pop up in Southeast Asia as well, where these are fully fledged industries which are promoting these campaigns, and it's I don't know if I would quite say it's acceptable yet, but it's one of those, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, everybody knows it's going on type things. Where it's not like wildly outside the realms of acceptability, that these kind of campaigns are going on. And also you're sort of seeing and in other situations, you're seeing sort of the push-pull of the accusation of running disinformation campaigns being used by both sides against political opponents. Like, it's a very politicized debate in a lot of contexts, like a domestically politicized debate. And again, I think that really complicates the idea of sort of having these ethical norms of sort of how you put it into practice when it is part of the muddy political fight in a lot of places.
That's right. And I think that we've seen, that sometimes it's almost, because this issue has been so politicized, it almost becomes, exciting to be a target of an influence operation, because then you can talk about it, right? And obviously we take, these issues really seriously, and as should the general public. But, spurious attribution claims do come sometimes because of how politicized this space can be, because it becomes almost, a juicy, conversation topic for, individuals across a number of different spaces.
Thank you all so much for those very interesting answers. And we've got some comments coming in from people who are watching. So thank you all to all of you who are posting comments. One of the first questions is, how can researchers better attribute operations on the apps that are owned by Facebook? So that being Facebook, Instagram, and perhaps they also mean WhatsApp. And they say, especially when we do not have access to internal telemetry, I don't know how to pronounce that, data from Facebook, and discussing how the Facebook open source investigation trick used to allow matching email addresses to Facebook profiles directly, but that's been disabled. I don't know whether that's a question for you, Olga, if you're happy to answer.
Yeah, I think I can certainly answer. And I also think perhaps Emerson can chime in, having, worked together on a number of investigations. There are times where, we are able to see a certain set of activity. And then open source investigative researchers at DFR Lab, at Stanford's Internet Observatory, at Graphica, and other research organizations, and even, across numerous other sort of individual independent researchers, are able to find a number of different ways of corroborating what we've been able to find. Of course, when a government makes a certain type of attribution claim, or a platform does, there is different levels of visibility that each organization has, as Emerson has stated previously. But what we do see is that there is, perhaps an understanding of tactics and behaviors that one can determine is, constantly being used by a certain set of actors. And so, we call these TTPs. And so if you start to track a certain actor or a nation state, you might be able to, sort of know that their hand might be behind something, or with some level of confidence be able to make some kind of claim. And so there are ways to do this kind of work. There are open source methods to perhaps, in some cases, people will joke that open source investigative research sometimes just just involves basic Googling, right? Looking up, reverse image searching certain logos or images, trying to figure out where someone might have gotten certain information, looking at, registration information, all kinds of things that are sort of available out there for the open source research community. And there are, a number of examples where there's really an interesting investigation that we worked with DFR Lab together on, in July of 2018, where there was this moment where we had identified, based on our internal tracking of actors to the Internet Research Agency, an operation where, we were relatively confident because of what we had seen around it being linked to actors connected to the Internet Research Agency. But at the same time, investigators at DFR Lab, including Ben Nimmo and others, were able to see that that particular network had also used a lot of images that had previously been repurposed from the Internet Research Agency. Now, that sort of method carries with it a warning, and I think it's important to say that up front, because content-based assessment is helpful for attribution, but it isn't everything. We've certainly seen threat actors over the years repurpose political cartoons, use memes and content from general civic debate online. And so there are ways in which you can use content to sort of corroborate a claim that you might see, but you have to be really careful about how confident that content-based attribution might make your assessment.
And to that, I'll just add, I know different researchers are coming from different places with different access to these institutional partnerships. And in those cases, I kind of characterize it as maybe a friendly arms race with Facebook or other tech platform companies, because you're not allowed to scrape these platforms. But I think a lot of independent researchers try to do so because it's extremely helpful. Graph search used to be an invaluable tool for these sorts of attributions. That's no longer accessible. Later in this excellent question was alluded a method by which you used to be able to match email addresses with Facebook profiles. You can't do that anymore, but I can think of some pretty good privacy reasons why you can't do that anymore. So it is kind of a back and forth. And I would say, a few years ago, if you were doing research in this space, there weren't many people you could contact on the platforms to draw attention to it because the teams just weren't what they are today. And when you're an independent researcher, going to Twitter, going to the court of public opinion, publicizing your research is always an option, and it is a way to compel some action. But there are more people and more places you can reach out to now to try to work collaboratively than was the case a few years ago.
Thank you both so much for that. We've got some other great questions that have come in. This one's from Daniel Ben-Shul, and he asks, in the current fractured information environment where state-sponsored disinformation is so blatant and rife, how can you mitigate against this in communicating attribution? I don't know who wants to take that one. Elise, do you want to answer?
I mean, I don't think anybody's cracked this especially well yet. It's always the difficulty of sort of how you debunk disinformation without repeating the disinformation, which we know can in some ways like contribute to the spread of the disinformation. So it's fairly tricky, particularly when it is. I mean, obviously, if it's disinformation which is way out there, ridiculous, not particularly good to start off with, that makes it much easier. But if it's disinformation which is quite well crafted and therefore it has quite a compelling message, so I'm thinking particularly about anti-vaccine disinformation or something like that, which really strikes a chord with people and really sort of hooks into something which is already in the public psyche in whatever sort of target community they're looking at. That's really tricky. It's really tricky. I don't I'd be interested to know if Olga and Emerson have sort of particular foolproof methods for it, but I don't think anybody has quite cracked how to do it yet.
Olga, Emerson, any solutions?
Well, one observation here. I find it interesting that this panel essentially hasn't used the word disinformation, because I'm finding it has less and less descriptive value when we're talking about this sorts of stuff. We're interested in methods, and when we talk about influence operations here, we're specifically talking about clandestine social media manipulation. What we broadly refer to as disinformation is often, well, it's propaganda coming from nations with which we disagree. But I find that a lot of state actors, maybe with the exception of Iran, because they're sanctioned out of the international broadcast space. But for a lot of other actors, they're turning increasingly to digital propaganda, but they're not exactly hiding the origin of who's saying this stuff. And in fact, this is an argument, not mine. It's been advanced first by Jacob Shapiro of Princeton University, but he makes a very compelling argument that when we talk about this clandestine social media manipulation by state actors, there are really only a finite number of groups that engage in it. And not only that, but they're often detectable. And as time has gone on, when it's clearly state-sponsored activity, I'm thinking of the US. The US has established clear punishments for this sort of behavior. It was actually President Trump who signed an executive order that mandated sanctions on individuals who engaged in, clandestine social media manipulation targeting U.S. electoral processes. He didn't use it much, but when the ODNI assessment came out last week, that same authority was referenced, and it's very likely that Biden will use this authority. In the ODNI report, we also learned that Chinese actors considered a larger clandestine influence campaign targeting the U.S. election and decided against it because it wasn't worth the risks. So there's an argument that state behavior in this realm can actually be deterred and may actually diminish as time goes on, even as there's that broader normative shift. So you see it much more in different domestic information environments.
Can I push back on that a little bit? Do we think that it was a matter of deterrence, or do we think it was just not necessary because there was so much going on in the US? Like the US did a good job of messing with its own election. I would argue. I'm not sure that it really needed. I sort of feel like if I was sitting in Moscow or Beijing, I'd be like, no, they've got this. Like we can just sit back and watch.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to directly contest that point. That was my main assessment during the election. Even the Russian operations we know about saw very little traffic or impact relative to a single deeply harmful story out of a U.S. outlet. But I would say it is still the case that China was weighing the benefits and risks, because it is. There is that risk of when a state-sponsored action is discovered and traced back, there is that risk that state will suffer dearly for that. That has been the case, I think, for Russia. And I still think it was a risk-benefit calculation, but almost also certainly a factor that the CCP looked at this insane state of American politics and decided it couldn't affect it that much anyway.
I'll add that I think, when we look at types of operations, we have to think not only about the targets, but also the themselves and the methods, which to assume, oftentimes we'll see, different organizations will say, employing the Russian playbook, right? And this concept of like the Russian playbook being used by one organization or another is sort of, become a talking point in a number of different articles and op-eds. But this idea is, each organization, each government probably has own incentives. And, we've used from the lens of who might be targeted to viewing, okay, what are their incentives? Each country perhaps, might be a wealthy nation that doesn't meddle or meddles in a day. Other might be up from a position and trying to ensure that they react in their own country. Think about all incentives that really help inform how I operate externally. That's also one of the reasons it's important to look at domestic operations, because oftentimes some of these threat actors, before they ever target any foreign nation state or populace, they will target their own population. And so when you look at the methods with which they do that, you can sort of see what they might be able to export to other countries.
Thanks so much for that, all of you. We have another question which asks, are you seeing an increase in non-state actors engaging in influence operations? And this specific question mentions Hezbollah, but I wonder whether that's one for you, Emerson?
The short answer is yes, but I've been trying to think of, I saw this question and loved it, but I've been trying to think of a particular case. Maybe Olga or Elise would be able to help me as well. But it's more, so Hezbollah is a non-state actor, but it's also a political party in Lebanon. And it's more an issue that I think previously we haven't, well, there hasn't been the bandwidth, there hasn't been the interest in this subject to make attributions to particular parties in different political systems. That previously, there was 2 years ago, if you wanted to study Russian government operations, that was all well and good. But if you wanted to study different parties in different countries that were not necessarily targeting the United States or Europe, it was hard to get that the resources to do so. And actually, I think the specific case was actually regarding an opposition party in Yemen. It was a report through the Stanford Internet Research Observatory. But the point is, only recently have we begun to get these excellent studies of manipulation by different parties in different non-US, non-Western political contexts. And so that when we see, for instance, Hezbollah briefly alluded to in the ODNI report, that's something where we simply don't have enough attention on these sorts of behaviors yet. But I think our studies will increasingly shift to this interesting and developing field now that we do have enough people engaged in it.
I'll also chime in.
Yeah, I mean, and sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I think this ties back to the point that I was making earlier about how the funding skews the perception of this entire space, in the sense that there is funding available for organizations like Emerson's, the organization that I used to work for, ASPI, or the organization I currently work for, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, to do work on things like foreign interference. But there's, very little funding available to do this, similar sorts of work in terms of domestic interference. It's just not something that attracts the same level of resources, and therefore it's not something that sees the same level of research, and therefore you don't see the same level of reporting. And it sort of skews the picture all the way down. And then you have academics who do secondary studies using the data from media reports, which have been skewed by the funding at the start, and you end up with this this entire body of just very skewed research. I'm sorry, Olga, off you go.
No worries. Yeah. And I think just jumping off of that point directly, one of the things that we've been trying to do with our investigative team at Facebook is really focus on, we're looking at the behavior, right? We're not we don't make, policy determinations based on the actor or the content that they're sharing. And so one of the benefits of doing something like that is that we've actually, our investigative team, who have expertise in a number of different regions around the world and different languages, have actually found operations using an understanding of these behaviors from numerous countries and from numerous actors. So, a lot of the operations, if you look at our monthly reporting on coordinated and authentic behavior, a number of the that we've taken down have actually been, domestically targeting their population, connected to firms that are engaging in influence for hire, to local NGOs, or in the United States, for example. We did a number of in the lead up to the US 2020 election that, were connected to either far right actors or websites or consulting firms. And so, you do see this sort of diversity of actors that are involved in the space, sometimes because, that's an obfuscation technique for a state actor, but sometimes, this really is, as Elise mentioned previously, countries. We've in Ukraine and in Georgia, for example, where these types of organizations are quite prevalent, and they are often targeting domestic political and civic debate.
Thank you so much, Olga, and thank you so much to everyone. Sadly, we've run out of time, but I'm sure that all of our brilliant panelists, if you want to put your questions to them, send them a message on Twitter or otherwise, would be happy to answer them. I want to say a big thank you to them for all of their excellent expertise and answers, in spite of our technical gremlins. Thank you to the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, who this was in collaboration with, as well as Carnegie's Endowment's Partnership for Countering Influence Operations, and also to you guys all for listening and coming along. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.